The farmer heard it before he saw anything. A small whimper rising from the ditch choked with cattails. He'd been driving County Road 200 West checking fence lines when he spotted the green Ford station wagon tilted at an impossible angle, passenger door hanging open like a broken jaw. Then he saw her, face down in the shallow culvert, yellow sundress torn at the shoulder, two dark wounds in the back of her head. The whimper came again. A toddler crawled toward him through the weeds, curly blonde hair matted with dirt, face burned bright red from 14 hours in the July sun. She'd spent the night beside her murdered mother's body. Phyllis Ann Baylor, 26 years old, had been driving home to see her parents. She never made it. For 53 years, the man who pulled her off that lonely highway lived freely in Indiana, hidden in plain sight, until modern science finally whispered his name. If cases like this matter to you, stories of families who never stopped fighting, subscribe and hit the bell. These investigations take weeks to research. Your support means I can keep telling them. Now let's tell Phyllis's story. Phyllis Ann Miller was born May 15, 1946 in Bluffton, Indiana, a farming town of 3,000 where everyone knew everyone, church happened every Sunday, and front doors stayed unlocked. Her parents, Harold and Evelyn Miller, owned 40 acres 2 miles outside town. Harold worked the fields. Evelyn kept the books, raised chickens, and tended a garden that fed them through winter. They measured wealth in good soil and healthy livestock. Phyllis grew up with dirt under her fingernails. She milked cows before school, picked green beans in summer heat, showed heifers at the Wells County 4-H fair. She learned to sew from Evelyn, stitching her own school dresses on an old Singer machine. She learned patience from Harold, who could spend an entire afternoon repairing a fence post without saying 10 words. At Bluffton High School, she took home economics and business typing. College wasn't discussed, not because her parents didn't value education, but because the path seemed clear. Girls from farms like theirs got practical skills, found steady work, married decent men, raised families. Phyllis wanted exactly that. No grand ambitions, just stability, love, a home of her own. She graduated in 1964 wearing a dress Evelyn made from fabric bought at the general store. The ceremony lasted an hour. Afterward, Harold shook her hand, his version of a hug, and told her he was proud. 3 months later, Phyllis moved 90 miles south to Indianapolis. The city felt massive compared to Bluffton's 3,000 residents. She found a secretarial position at a small manufacturing firm that made industrial gaskets. The work was straightforward, typing invoices, answering phones, filing purchase orders. She rented a room in a boarding house on the east side, shared a bathroom with 3 other girls, ate most meals from a hot plate. Every other weekend, she drove back to Bluffton in a used Chevrolet Harold helped her buy. Evelyn would have pot roast waiting. They'd sit at the kitchen table, and Phyllis would tell them about the city, the noise, the traffic lights, the grocery stores that stayed open past 6 o'clock. In 1968, she met Robert Baylor at a church social. He worked as a mechanic at a garage in Greenwood, a suburb south of Indianapolis. He was quiet like Harold, practical like Evelyn. They married that September in a small ceremony at Bluffton Methodist Church. Evelyn made the wedding dress. 27 people attended. They rented a small apartment in Greenwood. Robert worked 6 days a week. Phyllis kept her secretarial job part-time after the wedding, saving money for furniture and kitchen appliances. Their life was simple and unadorned. Weekend drives through Brown County to see the leaves change, Sunday dinners with canned soup and grilled cheese. Evenings spent watching television on a black-and-white set Robert fixed himself. On April 12, 1969, Phyllis gave birth to Sherry Lynn Baylor. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, curly blonde hair from birth. Phyllis quit her job to stay home full-time, and for 3 years her world shrank to the dimensions of their apartment. Changing diapers, mashing carrots, singing lullabies she remembered from her own childhood. She was a good mother in the quiet, unremarkable way of women who don't seek recognition. She sewed Sherry's clothes on the same Singer machine she'd learned on as a girl. She baked apple pies from Evelyn's recipe, the crust always flaky and golden. When Sherry had nightmares, Phyllis would rock her in the chair by the window until the crying stopped. By 1972, money grew tight. Robert's hours at the garage had been cut. Phyllis took a part-time clerk position at a hardware store 3 mornings a week. Evelyn offered to watch Sherry on those days, but the drive to Bluffton was too far. So Phyllis brought Sherry to a neighbor's apartment, paid her $2 a day, and spent those mornings restocking shelves and operating the cash register. She was 26 years old. She had freckles across her nose that never faded and hair she kept in a practical bob that required no maintenance. She had calloused hands from years of farm work that never quite softened. She had a daughter she loved more than her own breath and parents who still kept her bedroom exactly as she'd left it. On the afternoon of July 7, 1972, Phyllis packed the green 1968 Ford station wagon Robert had bought used the year before. It was a Friday, cloudless and hot, the kind of July day where heat shimmers rose from asphalt and cicadas screamed from every tree. She was driving to Bluffton for the weekend. Evelyn had called Wednesday night to ask if they'd come up. She missed her granddaughter, wanted to make a special dinner. Phyllis agreed immediately. Robert would join them Saturday after finishing his shift at the garage. She packed light, a duffel bag with clothes for her and Sherry, a small cooler with juice boxes and string cheese, Sherry's stuffed bear that went everywhere, a bag of crackers for the drive. She wore a simple yellow sundress with small white flowers, practical sandals, her hair pinned back with a tortoiseshell clip. Sherry, 3 years old and boundless energy, wore red shorts and a striped shirt Phyllis had made from leftover fabric. She clutched her stuffed bear and asked 40 questions in 10 minutes. Is Grandma making pot roast? Can we see the chickens? Will Grandpa let me sit on the tractor? Phyllis loaded the car in the apartment parking lot, checked the oil because Robert had taught her to, made sure the spare tire was inflated. She buckled Sherry into the passenger seat. This was 1972, before child safety seats were required, before anyone thought much about seatbelts in the back. Around 3 o'clock, she started the engine. Robert had left for work hours earlier, so there was no one to wave goodbye to. She pulled out of the parking lot, turned north, and headed towards State Road 37, which would take them through farmland and small towns all the way to Bluffton. It was supposed to be a 2-hour drive, easy and familiar. She'd made this trip 100 times. Evelyn had a pot roast in the oven by 4:30. She set the table for 4, put out the good napkins, filled a pitcher with sweet tea. Harold came in from the barn, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, asked what time Phyllis would arrive. Should be here by 5:36 at the latest, Evelyn said. But 5:30 came and went, then 6, then 7. By 8 o'clock, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window watching the driveway, watching the road beyond it. The pot roast dried out in the oven. Harold sat at the table, silent, his jaw tight. At 9 o'clock, Evelyn called the apartment in Greenwood. No answer. At 11 o'clock, she called Robert at the garage. He'd just gotten home, assumed they'd arrived hours ago. They're not here, Evelyn said, her voice steady but strained. Robert felt ice flood his chest. He called the Indiana State Police at midnight, reported his wife and daughter missing. A bulletin went out for a green 1968 Ford station wagon, Indiana plates, last seen heading north from Indianapolis. Volunteers from Bluffton formed search parties at dawn. They drove every back road between Greenwood and Bluffton, checked ditches, peered into wooded areas. stopped at gas stations to ask if anyone had seen a young woman with blonde hair and a toddler. Harold and Evelyn didn't sleep. They sat in the living room waiting by the telephone, praying for headlights in the driveway. The headlights never came. At 10:15 on the morning of July 8th, a farmer named Eugene Kessler drove his pickup truck along County Road 200 West in Allen County, checking fence lines on his property. The road was gravel and dirt, barely 2 lanes wide, cutting through cornfields that stood 7 feet tall and thick as walls. Kessler saw the station wagon first, a flash of green metal tilted at an odd angle in the drainage ditch. The passenger door hung open. The rear wheels had sunk into soft mud. He slowed his truck, pulled onto the shoulder, and climbed out. The morning was already hot. The sky washed pale blue. Cicadas droned from the corn. Kessler walked toward the vehicle, boots crunching on gravel. Then he saw her. Phyllis lay face down in the shallow culvert beside the car, half hidden by weeds and cattails. Her yellow sundress was torn at the shoulder. Her legs were bare, scratched, streaked with dried blood. Kessler took 3 steps closer and saw the wounds. 2 dark holes in the back of her head, small caliber execution style. He froze. His hands shook. He'd lived in Allen County 62 years, raised cattle, buried his parents, seen stillborn calves and barn fires and drought. But this was different. He turned to run back to his truck. Then he heard it, a small sound, a whimper. He spun back toward the ditch. Movement in the tall grass, something crawling. A child. Sherry Baylor, 3 years old, emerged from the weeds. Her curly blonde hair was matted with dirt and burrs. Her striped shirt was filthy. Her face was bright red from sunburn, her lips cracked and dry. She blinked in the sunlight, disoriented, and reached toward Kessler with both hands. "Mama," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Kessler scooped her up, felt her small body trembling. She was dehydrated, dazed, but alive. She'd spent the night out here, 14 hours, beside her mother's corpse, exposed to heat and mosquitoes and whatever animals prowled the cornfields after dark. He ran to his truck, still holding her, and drove straight to the nearest farmhouse with a telephone. By 11 o'clock, the Allen County Sheriff's Department had 3 patrol cars at the scene. By noon, Indiana State Police arrived. By 1 o'clock, the area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and a team of investigators began processing what was now a homicide scene. Detective Sergeant William Hargrove took lead. He was 48 years old, a 20-year veteran of the state police, and he'd worked exactly 2 murders in his career. Both domestic cases where the suspect was arrested within hours. This was different. This was a young mother killed on a rural highway with no witnesses, no obvious motive, and a crime scene that had been exposed to the elements for nearly a full day. The first priority was Sherry. Paramedics transported her to Lutheran Hospital in Fort Wayne, 15 miles north. She was treated for severe dehydration, sunburn, and mild shock. Physically, she'd survive. Emotionally, the doctors couldn't say. When social workers tried to interview her, she spoke in fragments. "Bad man," Mama screamed. "Bad man, stop the car." She described someone tall with dark hair. That matched half the men in Indiana. Hargrove stood over Phyllis's body as the medical examiner worked. Dr. Carl Brenner, the county coroner, knelt in the mud, taking notes on a clipboard. 2 gunshot wounds to the back of the head, Brenner said. Small caliber, probably a 22 or 25. Powder burns suggest close range, maybe 6 inches. She was on the ground when he shot her. Phyllis's sundress had been ripped open. Her undergarments were missing. Brenner collected samples from her body, semen on her thighs, on the fabric of her dress, evidence of violent sexual assault. "How long has she been here?" Hargrove asked. "Lividity and rigor suggest 12 to 18 hours. I'd estimate time of death between 4 and 6 p.m. yesterday. Hargrove did the math. Phyllis left Greenwood around 3. She should have reached Bluffton by 5:30. She was killed halfway through the journey right around dinner time, on a road so remote that no one heard the gunshots. The station wagon yielded little. The driver's seat was pushed back, suggesting someone taller than Phyllis had been behind the wheel at some point. Her purse was gone, wallet, identification, whatever cash she'd carried. Investigators found tire tracks in the mud behind the Ford, evidence that another vehicle had pulled up close, maybe boxed her in. Hargrove walked the scene for an hour, trying to reconstruct events. County Road 200 West saw maybe 10 cars a day. Phyllis had been driving north, taking back roads to avoid the highway. Someone forced her to stop, maybe flagged her down, maybe blocked the road. He pulled her out of the car, assaulted her in the ditch, shot her twice, and drove away. Sherry must have stayed in the vehicle or crawled into the weeds. The killer either didn't notice her or didn't care. One detail haunted Hargrove: the precision of the gunshots. 2 rounds, close range, back of the head. That wasn't panic. That was execution. By evening, news reached Bluffton. The Wells County Sheriff called Harold and Evelyn Miller and asked them to come to the station. They drove in silence, Evelyn gripping Harold's arm. An officer met them in the lobby and delivered the news with professional detachment. "We found Phyllis. I'm very sorry." Evelyn collapsed into Harold's chest. He held her upright, his face carved from stone, and said nothing. Robert Baylor heard from a state police chaplain who drove to Greenwood. Robert had been pacing his apartment for 18 hours, surviving on coffee and terror. When the chaplain said the words, "I'm afraid I have very difficult news," Robert sat down on the couch and stared at the wall. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just sat there, hands folded in his lap as the chaplain explained that Sherry was alive, that she was at the hospital, that he could see her soon. Evening news across Indiana broke the story. Mother murdered on rural highway. Toddler survives night alone. By Sunday morning, it was front-page news in the Indianapolis Star. By Monday, reporters from Chicago and Cincinnati arrived in Fort Wayne, looking for the family, looking for investigators, looking for anything that would feed the growing fear rippling through rural communities. A random killer was loose in the cornfields. At the Bluffton Methodist Church that Sunday, the congregation held a special service for Phyllis. 300 people attended. Evelyn sat in the front pew, veiled, silent. Harold sat beside her, staring at his hands. The pastor spoke about God's mysterious ways and the comfort of heaven and the strength of community. Evelyn heard none of it. She could only think of her daughter in that ditch, alone, terrified, calling for help that never came. They buried Phyllis on July 12th, 5 days after she died. They buried her in Bluffton Cemetery under a maple tree, her casket closed because of what the killer had done. The headstone was simple. Phyllis Ann Baylor, beloved mother and daughter, 1946-1972. Sherry attended, held by Robert. She was too young to understand. She asked where Mama was. No one had an answer she could comprehend. Hargrove attended the funeral, standing in the back, watching the crowd. Serial killers sometimes showed up to their victim services. He studied every face, looking for someone who didn't belong, someone watching too intently. He saw only grief. Back at the Allen County Sheriff's Department, evidence from the crime scene filled 3 cardboard boxes. The most important items: Phyllis's torn sundress, samples collected by Dr. Brenner, fibers from the station wagon, went into a locked evidence locker. In 1972, forensic science offered limited options. They could determine blood type from the semen samples. Type A positive, which matched approximately 40% of the male population. They could analyze the bullets. .22 caliber, common as dirt, fired from a pistol that could be one of a million. Hargrove interviewed over 100 people in the first month. Truckers who used County Road 200 West, farm workers, transients spotted at nearby gas stations. A man fitting Sherry's vague description, tall, dark hair, was questioned in Fort Wayne. His alibi checked out. Another lead came from a woman who claimed she saw a man in a blue pickup truck acting suspiciously near the area on July 7th. Investigators tracked down every blue pickup in 3 counties. None led anywhere. Robert Baylor took a polygraph test voluntarily. He passed without hesitation. Detectives cleared him completely within a week. There was no insurance policy, no affair, no motive. He was a widower and a grieving father trying to raise a traumatized toddler alone. The investigation consumed Hargrove. He worked 16-hour days, chased every tip, re-interviewed witnesses, combed through criminal records of known sex offenders in the region. By autumn, the leads dried up. By winter, the case was cold. But Hargrove made one critical decision. He insisted that all biological evidence be preserved. He labeled the boxes himself. Baylor homicide, 1972, do not destroy. He told his colleagues, "Someday science will catch up. Someday we'll be able to test this." They looked at him like he was naive. He didn't care. The boxes went into the evidence room, stacked on a shelf, and sat there as months turned into years. As detectives retired and new ones took their place. As the case file grew thick with dead ends and false starts. As the world moved on and forgot about Phyllis Baylor. But Evelyn Miller didn't forget. On July 7, 1973, 1 year after her daughter's murder, Evelyn drove to Bluffton Cemetery and stood at Phyllis's grave. She brought fresh flowers and a candle in a glass jar. She knelt in the grass, touched the headstone, and whispered a promise. "We'll find him someday, baby. I swear to God we'll find him." She had no idea it would take 53 years. Detective Sergeant William Hargrove kept a photograph of Phyllis Baylor taped to his office wall. Not the crime scene photo. He didn't need reminders of what had been done to her. This was a family snapshot. Phyllis holding infant Sherry, both of them smiling, taken maybe 6 months before the murder. Evelyn had given it to him during one of her many visits to the station. "So you remember she was a person," Evelyn had said. "Not just a case number." Hargrove stared at that photo every morning for 2 years. The case consumed Hargrove in ways he couldn't explain to his wife. He worked 70-hour weeks through the summer of 1972, barely sleeping, running down every lead that crossed his desk. The state police assigned 2 additional investigators to assist, but Hargrove treated this case like it was his alone to solve. Hargrove started with sex offenders. 47 registered in Indiana's primitive paper system. He interviewed 31 personally. 23 had alibis. 8 didn't, until they did. A paroled rapist from Fort Wayne matched Sherry's vague description. Tall, dark hair. But his mother placed him in South Bend that afternoon, 4 hours north. Neighbors confirmed it, cleared. A woman reported a blue pickup truck idling on County Road 200 West around 4:30. Partial plate, H7. Hargrove's team found 43 matching vehicles across Indiana. 6 weeks of interviews. 39 had never been near Allen County. 3 had legitimate reasons. Work, family visits. 1 was a traveling salesman checking a map. None had killed Phyllis. Truckers who used the road that day were cleared through shipping logs. 1 driver passed the area at 3:45, saw nothing unusual. By 5 o'clock, when Phyllis was attacked, he was 70 miles away, confirmed by delivery receipts. Dead end after dead end. By October 1972, Hargrove had interviewed over 100 people. He'd driven every mile of road between Greenwood and Bluffton, walked the crime scene a dozen times, reviewed the evidence until he could recite every detail from memory. The .22 caliber bullets removed from Phyllis's skull showed rifling patterns consistent with a cheap pistol, the kind sold in hardware stores and pawn shops across the Midwest. Untraceable. The semen samples gave them a blood type, A positive. That eliminated some suspects but included millions of men. In 1972, DNA profiling didn't exist. The concept of genetic fingerprinting was science fiction. All they had was blood typing, and it wasn't enough. Hargrove's supervisors began pressuring him to move on. Other cases demanded attention. Resources couldn't be allocated indefinitely to a single unsolved murder, no matter how brutal. "We've done everything we can," his captain said during a November meeting. "Sometimes they don't get solved." Hargrove refused to accept it. He kept working nights, reviewing files, following up on cold leads that warmed slightly before going cold again. A man in Ohio confessed to killing a woman matching Phyllis's description. Turned out he was schizophrenic and confessing to crimes he'd seen on television. A prisoner in Michigan claimed he knew who'd done it, offered to trade information for early parole. He knew nothing, just gaming the system. The break Hargrove hoped for never came, but he made one decision that would matter decades later. He insisted that all biological evidence from the crime scene be preserved indefinitely. In 1972, this wasn't standard procedure. Evidence storage was limited. Old cases got purged to make room for new ones, but Hargrove fought his supervisors, argued, pleaded, and finally got approval to keep everything. "Someday science will catch up," he told the evidence technician as they sealed the boxes. "Someday someone will be able to test this DNA stuff I keep reading about." The technician, a 23-year-old clerk named Dennis, gave him a skeptical look. "That's Star Trek stuff, Sarge." "Maybe, but keep it anyway." The boxes went into the evidence room. Phyllis's torn sundress, the samples Dr. Brenner had collected, fibers from the station wagon, photographs, autopsy reports. Everything labeled and logged. Everything waiting. By spring 1973, the state police officially classified the Phyllis Baylor case as cold. The file was moved to a storage cabinet. Hargrove was reassigned to other investigations. He never stopped thinking about it, though. Never stopped wondering what he'd missed. He attended every anniversary vigil Evelyn held. He'd stand in the back, hat in hand, watching the family grieve. When he retired in 1989, he wrote Evelyn a letter. "I'm sorry I couldn't find him. I'll carry that failure the rest of my life." Evelyn wrote back, "You tried. That's more than most would do, thank you." Hargrove died in 2003, never knowing his insistence on preserving evidence would eventually solve the case. The Baylor family home in Greenwood felt emptier with every passing month. Robert tried to maintain normalcy for Sherry's sake, but grief hollowed him out from the inside. He worked his shifts at the garage, came home to a silent apartment, heated canned soup for dinner. Sherry asked for her mother constantly during the first year. "Where's Mama? When is Mama coming back?" Robert didn't know how to answer. How do you explain murder to a 4-year-old? By 1974, Sherry had stopped asking. She'd forgotten most of her memories of Phyllis, forgotten the sound of her voice, the feel of her hands braiding hair, the taste of her apple pie. All she had were photographs and stories other people told her. Robert remarried in 1976, a quiet woman named Linda who worked at the grocery store. She was kind to Sherry, never tried to replace Phyllis, just offered stability in a home that desperately needed it. They had a son together in 1978. Sherry gained a half-brother and a stepmother, and life moved forward the way life does after tragedy. Not healing exactly, but adapting. But Evelyn never adapted. Harold Miller died in 1979, 7 years after Phyllis. Heart attack while working the fields, sudden and massive. Evelyn found him slumped against the tractor, still warm. The doctor said it was quick, painless. Evelyn wondered if grief had killed him as much as coronary disease. He'd never been the same after Phyllis died. Never spoke her name, couldn't bring himself to visit the grave. After Harold's death, Evelyn sold most of the farm and moved into a small house in Bluffton proper. She was 61 years old, widowed, childless. Her only daughter murdered, her husband dead, her granddaughter raised by someone else. She could have disappeared into quiet obscurity. Instead, she chose action. On July 7, 1973, the first anniversary of Phyllis's murder, Evelyn drove to Bluffton Cemetery at dawn. She brought fresh flowers, a candle in a glass jar, and a photograph of Phyllis in a small frame. She knelt at the grave, arranged the flowers, lit the candle. Then she prayed. Not the rote prayers from church, but raw pleas spoken directly to God. Show me who did this. Give me a sign. Don't let her be forgotten. When she finished, she stood and made a promise. I'll be back next year, and the year after that, every year until they find him. She kept that promise for 52 years. Every July 7th, Evelyn returned to the cemetery, sometimes alone, sometimes with Sherry and Robert, sometimes with friends from church. She always brought fresh flowers, usually daisies, Phyllis's favorite. She always lit a candle. She always spoke to the headstone as though Phyllis could hear. Local newspapers covered the vigils on milestone anniversaries. The 10th anniversary in 1982. Bluffton mother still seeks justice. The 20th in 1992. 2 decades later, questions remain. The 30th in 2002, will justice ever come? Evelyn gave interviews every time. She spoke calmly, without theatrics, stating facts. My daughter was murdered. Her killer is still out there. Someone knows something. She wrote letters, hundreds of them. Letters to the Indiana State Police, to the Allen County Sheriff, to the governor, to state legislators. She lobbied for funding for cold case investigations, for better evidence preservation protocols, for victim advocacy programs. She became a fixture at public hearings, her white hair and steady voice commanding attention. If you don't solve these cases, you're telling families like mine that our loved ones don't matter, she said during a 1995 legislative hearing on criminal justice funding. You're telling killers they can get away with it. I won't accept that. And neither should you. Some officials found her tiresome. Others admired her tenacity. None could ignore her. She called the Allen County Sheriff's Office every July 7th without fail. Have you tested the evidence? Have you looked at the case again? For 20 years, the answer was always the same. We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Miller. We haven't forgotten. But they had forgotten. The case file collected dust. Detectives came and went. The original investigators retired. New crimes demanded attention. Phyllis Baylor became a name in an old file, a sad story people mentioned when discussing unsolved cases, but nothing more. Except to Evelyn. She never remarried, never left Bluffton, devoted her entire life to keeping Phyllis's memory alive and demanding justice. She filled scrapbooks with newspaper clippings, police reports, photographs. She created a timeline of events she showed to every new detective assigned to cold cases. She refused to let them dismiss this as just another old murder. Friends urged her to move on, to find peace, to stop torturing herself. I'll find peace when he's found, she'd say. At night, alone in her house, she'd pull out the photo albums. Phyllis as a baby, Phyllis in her high school graduation gown, Phyllis holding Sherry at the hospital. She'd trace her finger over her daughter's face and whisper the same words she'd spoken at the grave. I haven't forgotten, baby. I'll never forget. Every July 7th, Evelyn Miller placed fresh daisies on her daughter's grave. It became ritual, sacred, and unbreakable. She'd wake before dawn, dress in one of the simple cotton dresses she'd sewn herself, and drive the 2 miles to Bluffton Cemetery. The maple tree over Phyllis's grave grew taller with each passing year. Its roots spread beneath the headstone, lifting it slightly, giving the granite an uneven tilt. Evelyn noticed but never complained. She liked that the tree was alive, growing, reaching toward the sky while her daughter stayed frozen at 26. The vigils started small. Just Evelyn in those early years kneeling in the grass, speaking to the stone. But word spread through Bluffton's small community. By the 10th anniversary in 1982, 20 people attended. By the 20th in 1992, 50. The local Methodist church made it an annual event, organizing candle-lighting ceremonies at dusk. Evelyn would stand before the gathered crowd, neighbors, church members, old friends of Phyllis, and tell the same story she'd told 100 times. The story of a young mother driving home for the weekend. The story of a killer who'd never been caught. The story of a family's endless wait for justice. Phyllis loved apple pie, Evelyn would say, her voice steady despite her age. She'd spend hours in the kitchen rolling out dough, making sure the crust was perfect. She was patient like that, meticulous. She'd pause, looking at the headstone. I used to think patience was a virtue. Now I'm not so sure. Patience feels like surrender, and I won't surrender. People would nod, murmur agreement. Some would cry. Evelyn never did, not in public. She'd learned to compartmentalize her grief, to channel it into determination rather than despair. After each vigil, she'd drive to the Allen County Sheriff's Office, 45 minutes each way, and request a meeting. The desk sergeant would politely tell her the detective wasn't available. She'd wait, sometimes for hours. Eventually, someone would come out, shake her hand, and give her the same update they'd given the year before. We're still looking, Mrs. Miller. The case remains open. Have you tested the evidence with new technology? Not yet, but we will, when funding allows. Funding never allowed. Evelyn turned 70 in 1988, then 80 in 1998. Her body aged, arthritis in her knees, cataracts in her left eye, hearing loss that forced her to wear aids, but her mind stayed sharp. She read voraciously. True crime magazines. Court TV, anything related to forensic science. In 1984, she read an article in Newsweek about DNA fingerprinting, a revolutionary technique developed by British scientist Alec Jeffreys. Genetic material could identify individuals with near certainty. She cut it out, drove to the sheriff's office, handed it to the detective on duty. You need to test the evidence, she said, with this DNA thing. The detective, a young man named Thompson who'd been born the year Phyllis died, looked at the article, then at Evelyn. Mrs. Miller, with respect, that technology isn't available here. Maybe in England, maybe in big city labs, but not in Allen County. Then send it to a big city lab. That costs money we don't have. How much? Thousands of dollars. I'll pay for it. Thompson blinked. Ma'am, how much? He sighed, closed the file he'd been working on. Even if you could pay, the technology isn't refined enough yet. It's experimental. It wouldn't hold up in court. Evelyn took the article back, folded it carefully, and put it in her purse. Then I'll wait until it's ready, but when it is, you're going to test that evidence. She left before he could respond. In 1989, the evidence boxes were nearly lost. The Allen County Sheriff's Department underwent a major reorganization. New administration, new filing systems, new evidence storage protocols. During the transition, hundreds of old case files and evidence boxes were inventoried for potential disposal. A clerk flagged the Baylor case boxes, 17 years old, unsolved, no active leads, for destruction. Workers wheeled the boxes to the loading dock, ready for disposal. Evelyn found out by accident. She'd called the sheriff's office for her annual July check-in and mentioned the evidence. The receptionist, new to the job, said, "Oh, I think those old boxes got thrown out." Evelyn drove to Fort Wayne in under an hour, ignoring speed limits. She stormed into the sheriff's office and demanded to speak to whoever was in charge. The chief deputy, caught off guard by the elderly woman's fury, tried to calm her down. "Mrs. Miller, I assure you we wouldn't dispose of evidence from an open case. Someone told me they're already gone." The chief deputy made calls. 20 minutes later, he returned, pale. "We found them. They were scheduled for disposal, but they're still here. I want to see them." He led her to the evidence room. The boxes sat on a cart near the loading dock door, stamped "Pending Disposal." Evelyn stood over them, trembling, and said very quietly, "If these had been destroyed, I would have sued this department into oblivion. Do you understand me?" The chief deputy nodded. "Mark them," she said. "Mark them as permanent, never to be destroyed, ever." He did. That afternoon, new labels were affixed. "Baylor Homicide. Evidence permanent. Do not dispose." The boxes went back into storage. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Now, back to Evelyn's fight. The 1990s brought new hope in the form of CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database launched by the FBI. By 1998, DNA profiling had become standard in criminal investigations. Evelyn read about it in the newspaper and made another trip to Fort Wayne. "You have a DNA profile from my daughter's case," she told Detective Maria Santos, who'd recently taken over cold case investigations. "You need to test it against this database." Santos, younger and more sympathetic than her predecessors, reviewed the file. "Mrs. Miller, I'll be honest. Our lab doesn't have the capability to extract DNA from evidence this old. The samples might be degraded." "Try anyway." Santos tried. She sent the evidence to the Indiana State Police Lab in Indianapolis. 3 months later, the results came back. Insufficient sample quality. The technology wasn't advanced enough to work with 1972-era evidence. Santos delivered the news in person, driving to Bluffton to meet Evelyn at her home. "I'm sorry," Santos said. "Maybe in a few years as technology improves." "How many years?" "I don't know." Evelyn, now 79 years old, sat in her armchair and looked at the detective with eyes that had seen too much disappointment. "I don't have many years left. I know. But I'll outlive my anger, I promise you that." In 2005, a breakthrough. New extraction techniques allowed forensic scientists to work with degraded samples. Santos contacted Evelyn immediately. "We're going to try again." This time it worked. Scientists extracted a DNA profile from the semen samples collected in 1972. The profile was entered into CODIS, cross-referenced against millions of samples from convicted offenders and arrestees across the country. No match. Santos called Evelyn with the update, expecting devastation. Instead, Evelyn said, "At least we have something now, at least we're ready." Ready for what? Ready for when he makes a mistake. But the killer never made a mistake. Years passed. The DNA profile sat in CODIS, waiting for a match that never came. False leads continued. In 2007, a man in Michigan was arrested for a similar crime, sexual assault and murder on a rural highway. Investigators tested his DNA against the Baylor case, not a match. In 2011, someone called the tip line claiming a bartender in Fort Wayne had bragged about killing a woman in the 1970s. Santos investigated. The bartender had been 12 years old in 1972. In 2014, a prisoner facing execution in Illinois gave a deathbed confession claiming he'd committed multiple unsolved murders, including one in Indiana. Santos drove 4 hours to interview him. His story didn't match any details from Phyllis's case. He was lying, seeking attention in his final days. Each time, Evelyn's hopes rose, then crashed. Each time, she returned to the cemetery, knelt at the grave, and whispered, "Not yet, baby, but soon." In 1995, at 26, the same age Phyllis had been when murdered, Sherry gave birth to her first daughter. Holding that infant, she finally understood the terror her mother must have felt in those final moments. She understood the terror Phyllis must have felt in her final moments, knowing she was about to leave a child motherless. Sherry started attending the vigils regularly. She brought her children, Evelyn's great-grandchildren, to the cemetery each July. She taught them about the grandmother they'd never met, showed them photos, shared stories Evelyn had told her. In 2003, Sherry established the Phyllis's Promise Foundation, a small nonprofit that supported families of cold case victims. She advocated for legislative funding, testified at public hearings alongside Evelyn, kept her mother's name in the public eye. "My daughter's carrying on the fight," Evelyn told a reporter during the 40th anniversary vigil in 2012. "That means something. That means Phyllis's death mattered." By 2018, Evelyn was 99 years old. She'd outlived most of her generation, buried friends and siblings, watched the world change in ways she could barely comprehend. Smartphones, the internet, social media, none of it made sense to her. But when Sherry came to visit one afternoon and mentioned something called genetic genealogy, Evelyn perked up. "Tell me about that," she said. Sherry explained the Golden State Killer case, how investigators had used DNA uploaded to public genealogy websites to identify a suspect after 40 years. Evelyn listened intently. When Sherry finished, Evelyn said, "Call Detective Santos. Tell her to do that." "Grandma, I don't know if they have funding." "I don't care about funding. Tell her to do it," Sherry called. Santos was already aware of the technique. She'd been waiting for approval and resources to send the Baylor evidence to a specialized lab. "It's going to cost around $5,000, Santos told Sherry. "I'll raise it," Sherry said. Within 2 months, the Phyllis's Promise Foundation crowdfunded the money. Community members, true crime enthusiasts, strangers who'd heard the story all contributed. By October 2024, they had enough. Santos packaged the evidence and sent it to Othram, a cutting-edge forensic genealogy lab in Texas. Then they waited. Again. Othram's laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, didn't look like the place where justice gets resurrected. It was a modern building with glass walls and clean white corridors, the kind of facility that could house a tech startup or pharmaceutical company. But inside, scientists worked on the dead, extracting genetic secrets from evidence so old most people had forgotten it existed. In November 2024, a package arrived from the Allen County Sheriff's Department. Inside, sealed evidence bags containing clothing fibers and biological samples. From a 1972 homicide, the case number was faded. The paperwork was typed on a manual typewriter. The samples themselves were 52 years old. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic geneticist, logged the evidence and began the extraction process. The semen samples had been stored properly, frozen, sealed, protected from contamination. But 5 decades of storage still degraded genetic material. DNA breaks down over time, fragmenting into smaller and smaller pieces. Traditional DNA profiling requires long, intact sequences, but Othram specialized in something different. SNP profiling, which analyzes single nucleotide polymorphisms, tiny variations in genetic code that remain detectable even in degraded samples. Walsh worked for 3 weeks, isolating genetic material, amplifying fragments, building a profile one piece at a time. By early December, she had enough data to generate a usable SNP profile. She uploaded it to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, public genealogy databases where people voluntarily share their genetic information to find relatives. The system searched for matches. Within hours, hits appeared. None were close relatives. No parents, siblings, or children. But there were third cousins, fourth cousins. distant branches of a family tree that could be traced backward through generations. Walsh forwarded the results to a genealogist named Rebecca Morris, who specialized in forensic genetic genealogy. Morris had worked on dozens of cold cases, including the Golden State Killer investigation. She understood how to build family trees from fragments. She started with the closest matches. A woman in Michigan, a man in Ohio, another woman in Pennsylvania. None had ever heard of Phyllis Baylor. None lived anywhere near Indiana in 1972. But their DNA told a story their conscious minds didn't know. Morris pulled birth certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries. She worked backward through time, constructing branches of a family tree. The matches all connected to a single ancestral couple, William and Martha Lienemann, German immigrants who settled in Grosse Pointe, Michigan in 1891. From that couple, multiple family lines descended. Morris traced each one, identifying living descendants, cross-referencing ages, locations, and criminal histories. One branch led to a family that had moved from Michigan to Indiana in the early 1970s. Morris's pulse quickened. She narrowed her focus. The suspect would have been male, likely between 20 and 40 years old in 1972, living in or near Allen County at the time of the murder. She found him in 2 weeks. Fred Allen Lienemann, born March 2, 1947 in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. Juvenile record for theft and assault in the 1960s. Moved to Anderson, Indiana in 1971. Age 25 at the time of Phyllis's murder. Anderson was 40 miles from the crime scene. An easy drive. Morris cross-referenced his name with criminal databases. Multiple arrests in Indiana through the 1980s and 1990s. Burglary, domestic violence, sexual assault. He'd served time in Indiana state prisons, been released, arrested again. A pattern of escalating violence. But he'd never been linked to Phyllis Baylor's murder. Never been questioned. Never been a suspect. Morris sent her findings to Detective Santos on December 18, 2024. Santos read the report 3 times, then she ran Fred Allen Lienemann through every database available. Driver's license records, jail bookings, court filings, tax records. The last entry stopped her cold. Fred Allen Lienemann died September 15, 2012. Natural causes, buried in Anderson Memorial Gardens. He'd been dead for 12 years. Santos sat in her office, staring at the computer screen, feeling 52 years of investigation collapse into a single bitter truth. They'd found him. But too late. She called Sherry Baylor first, rehearsing what to say during the drive to her office. When Sherry arrived, Santos led her to a conference room and laid out the genealogy report. "We identified your mother's killer," Santos said. "His name was Fred Allen Lienemann." Sherry's hand went to her mouth. "He died in 2012, natural causes. He never faced charges for what he did." Sherry stared at the photo Santos had pulled from an old booking record, a mug shot from 1985, a man in his late 30s, balding, unremarkable. He looked like someone's uncle, someone's neighbor, not a monster. "Are you sure?" Sherry asked. "We need confirmatory DNA from his remains, but the genealogy match is solid. I'm confident." "What now?" "We exhume his body. We extract DNA, we prove it scientifically, then we announce it publicly. Your mother's case will be closed." Sherry nodded slowly, absorbing information that felt both satisfying and hollow. "Grandma needs to know. I was planning to visit her tomorrow. I'll come with you." Evelyn Miller lived in a nursing home now, a small assisted living facility on the edge of Bluffton. She'd moved there in 2023 when living alone became impossible. She was 101 years old, frail but mentally sharp, still demanding updates on Phyllis's case whenever staff or visitors allowed. Santos and Sherry arrived the morning of December 19th. They found Evelyn in the common room sitting by a window, watching birds at a feeder outside. She wore a cardigan Phyllis had knitted in 1971, one of the few physical items she'd kept all these years. "Grandma," Sherry said gently. Evelyn turned. She saw Santos and immediately understood. "You found him." "Yes, ma'am." Evelyn closed her eyes. Her lips moved silently, prayer or relief or both. When she opened them again, tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. "Tell me his name." "Fred Allen Lieneman." Evelyn repeated it, tasting each syllable. "Was he from around here?" "Originally Michigan, moved to Anderson in 1971. He was 25 when he killed Phyllis." "Did he know her?" "No. We believe it was a random attack." Evelyn nodded. She'd always suspected that. The randomness made it worse somehow. Phyllis had done nothing wrong, provoked no one, simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong moment. "Is he in prison?" Santos hesitated. "Mrs. Miller, he died in 2012. We're going to exhume his body to confirm the DNA match. But the genealogy evidence is conclusive." Evelyn's face hardened. Not anger exactly, something colder. "He lived free. For 40 years, yes. 40 years. Evelyn looked out the window again. "He got to grow old. Phyllis didn't." Santos had no response. The injustice was absolute. Sherry took her grandmother's hand. "But we know now. We can finally know." Evelyn squeezed back. "I kept my promise. I told her I'd find him." "You did?" Evelyn turned to Santos. "When will you announce it?" "After we confirm the DNA, probably April. We'll hold a press conference." "I want to be there." "You will be." On January 14, 2025, a judge signed the exhumation order. 2 days later, workers at Anderson Memorial Gardens used a backhoe to dig up Fred Allen Lieneman's grave. His casket, corroded but intact, was lifted from the earth and transported to the county morgue. A forensic pathologist opened the casket. Lieneman's remains were skeletal but sufficient for testing. A femur bone was removed, sectioned, and shipped to Othram. Dr. Walsh extracted DNA from the bone marrow. The process took 3 weeks. By early February, she had a complete profile. It matched the 1972 semen sample perfectly. Every marker, every allele. Statistical probability of a coincidental match, 1 in several trillion. Fred Allen Lieneman had raped and murdered Phyllis Baylor. Santos received the confirmation on February 11th. She drafted her report that night, barely sleeping. The next morning, she briefed the sheriff, the prosecutor, and the Indiana State Police. "If he were alive, we'd charge him with murder, rape, and kidnapping," the prosecutor said. "Open and shut case, but he's not." "So what do we do?" Santos asked. "We close the case. We give the family answers. We hold a press conference. We let the world know justice has a long memory." Santos spent the next 2 months preparing. She contacted national media outlets, coordinated with the prosecutor's office, worked with Sherry to plan the announcement. They decided on April 16, 2025. No particular significance to the date, just when everything aligned. The press conference was held in Fort Wayne at the Allen County Courthouse. Reporters from CNN, NBC, ABC, and local Indiana stations filled the room. Cameras lined the back wall. Santos stood at a podium flanked by the sheriff, the prosecutor, and a representative from Othram. Sherry sat in the front row holding Evelyn's hand. Evelyn had insisted on attending despite her age and frailty. A nurse accompanied them, monitoring Evelyn's vitals, ready to intervene if the stress became too much. At 10 a.m., Santos began. On July 7, 1972, Phyllis Ann Baylor was murdered on County Road 200 West in Allen County. She was 26 years old. She was a mother, a daughter, a member of this community. For 53 years, her killer's identity remained unknown. Santos paused, letting the weight of that number settle. Today, using advanced forensic genetic genealogy, we can definitively name the person responsible. Fred Allen Lieneman, born March 2, 1947, killed Phyllis Baylor. He lived in Anderson, Indiana at the time. He had no known connection to her. This was a random act of violence. If Mr. Lieneman were alive today, he would face charges of murder, rape, and kidnapping. But he died in 2012 of natural causes. He will never stand trial. He will never face earthly justice. But his name is now known. His crime is solved. And Phyllis Baylor's family finally has answers. Santos gestured to Sherry and Evelyn. This family has waited 53 years. Evelyn Miller, Phyllis's mother, held a vigil every single year. She never stopped advocating. She never stopped believing. At 101 years old, she's here today to see her daughter's case closed. Reporters shouted questions. Santos answered them methodically, explaining the genealogy process, the DNA confirmation, Lieneman's criminal history. Then Sherry stepped to the microphone. "My mother died when I was 3, she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. I don't remember her, but I've spent my entire life trying to know her. Today I finally can. Not because I learned something new about who she was, but because I learned who took her away." She looked at the cameras. Fred Lieneman lived 40 years after killing my mom. He had a family. He had freedom. He died peacefully in his sleep. That's not justice, but knowing his name, that's something. It's more than we had yesterday. Sherry stepped back. Evelyn remained seated, too weak to stand, but she raised one trembling hand and said in a voice barely audible, "I kept my promise, baby." The room fell silent. The story exploded across national media. By evening, it was the lead segment on NBC Nightly News. The next morning, it appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today. Headlines varied. 53-year cold case solved. Genealogy cracks 1972 murder. Mother's 50-year vigil ends with answers. True crime podcasts picked it up. YouTube channels analyzed the case. Reddit threads dissected every detail. For 3 weeks, Phyllis Baylor's name was everywhere. Sherry gave dozens of interviews, always emphasizing the same points: preserve evidence, fund cold case units, never stop advocating. She appeared on Good Morning America, CNN, Dateline NBC. Each time she told her mother's story with the same quiet dignity Evelyn had modeled for decades. Evelyn declined most interview requests. She was too old, too tired. But she agreed to one. A local news station from Fort Wayne that had covered the case for 50 years. The reporter, a young woman named Anna Chen, visited Evelyn at the nursing home. And they sat by the window where Evelyn spent most of her days now. "How does it feel to finally have answers?" Chen asked. Evelyn thought for a long moment. Empty, relieved, angry, all at once. Angry. He lived free for 40 years. He hurt other people. If they'd caught him in 1972, those people would have been spared. Do you think the system failed? The system did the best it could with what it had. I don't blame the detectives, I blame time. And I blame him. What do you want people to remember about Phyllis? Evelyn's face softened. That she was kind, that she loved her daughter, that she made the best apple pie I ever tasted. She paused. And that she mattered. Even 53 years later, she still matters. Fred Lieneman's family released a brief statement through a lawyer. "We are shocked and horrified to learn of these allegations. We had no knowledge of his involvement in this crime. Our deepest sympathies go to the Baylor family. His children, 3 adults in their 40s and 50s, learned their father was a murderer from news reports. One daughter gave an anonymous interview to a podcast, describing her childhood with Fred as unremarkable. He was just normal, a little angry sometimes, but nothing crazy. I can't reconcile the man I knew with what he did. Investigators looked into whether Lienemann had committed other crimes. His DNA was compared against unsolved sexual assaults and murders in Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. No matches. Phyllis appeared to be his only murder, though he'd assaulted other women later, crimes for which he'd been caught and imprisoned. Santos theorized that the murder terrified him, made him realize how close he'd come to spending life in prison. He'd scaled back afterward, committing lesser crimes, serving short sentences, flying under the radar. Or maybe he'd just been lucky. For 40 years. On July 7, 2025, the 53rd anniversary of Phyllis's murder, the family held a private ceremony at Bluffton Cemetery. No media, no crowds, just Evelyn, Sherry, Sherry's children, and a handful of close friends. Pastor David Klein from Bluffton Methodist Church led a brief service. He read Psalm 23, the same passage read at Phyllis's funeral in 1972. Then Sherry spoke. "For 53 years we've come to this grave asking questions," she said. "Who did this? Why? Will we ever know? Today, we come with answers. The bad man has a name. Fred Allen Lienemann. He can't hurt anyone anymore. He can't hide anymore." She knelt and placed a bouquet of daisies on the headstone. "Mom, you can rest now. We all can." Evelyn, seated in a wheelchair at the grave's edge, leaned forward and touched the granite. Her fingers traced Phyllis's name, worn smooth by decades of weather. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "I found him." 4 generations stood together at that grave. Evelyn, Sherry, Sherry's children, and Sherry's grandchildren, the latter never knowing Phyllis, but carrying her story forward. They scattered wildflowers from County Road 200 West, picked from the roadside where Phyllis had died. The location was still rural, still quiet, still lined with cornfields. A small memorial marker had been placed there earlier that summer, funded by donations to Phyllis's Promise Foundation. It read, "Phyllis Ann Baylor, 1946-1972, beloved mother, never forgotten, justice found." 3 months later, on October 22, 2025, Evelyn Miller passed away in her sleep at the nursing home. She was 101 years old. The nurse found her in the morning, lying peacefully, a photograph of Phyllis clutched in her hand. Her obituary ran in newspapers across Indiana. Evelyn Miller, devoted mother and relentless advocate for justice, died peacefully after learning her daughter's killer had been identified. She spent 53 years refusing to let her daughter's murder go unsolved. Her perseverance led to one of the longest-running cold cases in Indiana history finally being closed. Hundreds attended her funeral. Detectives, prosecutors, journalists, victim advocates, people who'd followed the case for decades. They filled Bluffton Methodist Church to capacity, spilling into the aisles and doorway. Sherry delivered the eulogy. "My grandmother was born in 1924, she said. She lived through the Depression, World War II, the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Internet age. She saw the world change in ways she could never have imagined. But one thing never changed. Her love for her daughter, her determination to find justice. She outlived most of her generation. She outlived reasonable hope. But she never outlived her promise." Sherry's voice broke. She paused, steadied herself. Grandma never accepted defeat. Not when the case went cold. Not when detectives retired, not when evidence nearly got destroyed. For 53 years, she refused to let them forget Phyllis. And because she refused, we finally know the truth. Now she can rest. They buried Evelyn beside Phyllis in Bluffton Cemetery, under the maple tree that had grown so tall its branches touched the sky. The double headstone read, "Evelyn Miller, 1924-2025, beloved mother, promise keeper," and Phyllis Ann Baylor, 1946-1972, beloved daughter, finally at peace. Sherry continued running Phyllis's Promise Foundation. She testified before the Indiana legislature, securing funding for a statewide cold case unit. She partnered with Othram to help other families afford genetic genealogy testing. She became a national advocate for evidence preservation and victim rights. In interviews, she always mentioned Evelyn. "My grandmother taught me that giving up is not an option. You keep going, you keep fighting, even when it seems hopeless." Especially when it seems hopeless. Fred Lienemann's grave in Anderson remained unmarked, the family unwilling to place a headstone. Vandals would have destroyed it anyway. Some crimes erase a person's right to be remembered. But Phyllis's grave stayed immaculate. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, left by Sherry, by friends, by strangers who'd heard the story. The memorial marker on County Road 200 West became a pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts and victim advocates. The cornfields still stretched to the horizon, unchanged by time or tragedy. Farmers still worked the land. Families still drove those rural highways. And somewhere in the soil of Allen County, the echo of July 7, 1972 still lingered. A reminder that violence leaves scars that never fully heal, but also a reminder that some promises, no matter how impossible they seem, can be kept. 53 years is long enough to lose hope, but Evelyn Miller never did. She knelt at her daughter's grave year after year, decade after decade, refusing to accept what logic demanded, that some killers never face consequences. 53 years is a lifetime. Children are born, grow up, have children of their own. Careers begin and end. Presidents serve and leave office. Technology transforms the world. And all that time, a killer walks free, hidden in plain sight, confident he'll never face consequences. But evidence waits. DNA doesn't forget, and mothers who lose daughters don't surrender. Phyllis Baylor was 26 years old when Fred Lienemann pulled her off County Road 200 West and ended her life. She never got to see Sherry grow up, never met her grandchildren, never tasted old age or retirement or the quiet satisfaction of a life fully lived. Lienemann stole all of that. He lived another 40 years, married, had children, worked jobs, watched television, ate meals, celebrated birthdays. He died peacefully at 65, never charged, never punished, never forced to account for what he'd done. That's the reality. Justice in this case didn't mean a trial or a sentence or a prison cell. It meant a name, an answer, certainty. For Evelyn it was enough, not satisfying, not complete, but enough. She kept her promise. She found him. Phyllis's story endures not because of the crime, but because of what came after. A mother's 53-year vigil. A daughter's lifelong search for a woman she never knew. A community that refused to forget. Detectives who preserved evidence when it would have been easier to dispose of it. Scientists who developed technology that didn't exist when the crime occurred. All of it, every prayer, every letter, every vigil, every year, mattered. The cornfields of Allen County still stand. County Road 200 West still cuts through them, quiet and empty. The spot where Phyllis died is marked now, remembered now, sacred in its own way. And somewhere in whatever comes after this life, maybe Evelyn and Phyllis are together again. Maybe Evelyn is saying, "I found him, baby, I finally found him." And maybe Phyllis is answering, "I know, Mama, I know." They finally knew. Late, imperfect, incomplete, but certain. Before You Go in June 1976, Walton, Kentucky, Carol Sue Kleiber sang Amazing Grace at church. 4 hours later, she was dead, beaten, strangled, left in a ditch. For 46 years, her killer walked free. He was family. He sat in the same pews where Carol had sung, watched her mother grieve. In 2022, genetic genealogy exposed him. When police knocked, he said, I wondered when you'd come. Click the video on your screen to see how DNA technology solved a nearly 50-year-old murder and exposed a killer who'd been hiding in plain sight the entire time. This one will haunt you.